In the last three videos about the theoretical contribution, I introduced three paths for your research to make a theoretical contribution to your field. You can challenge an existing theory without proposing a new theory. You can challenge a theory by developing a new theory. You can also synthesize divergent literature into a fresh theory. In this video, I'll introduce the fourth path for theoretical contributions you can make in the field of educational leadership. It is to specify boundary conditions of a theory. One complaint from leadership practitioners is that theories are not applicable. As is usually the case, the devil is in the details. Researchers often claim that context matters. But which context matters to what extent? Context has been labeled as an amorphous concept capturing theory-relevant surrounding phenomena or temporal conditions. As a researcher, it is not sufficient to say it is complicated. Without a specified context, it is no surprise that leadership practitioners find it difficult to apply a theory in a meaningful way. The limited attention to context specification leads to the leadership research practice gap. To mitigate this gap, you can specify boundaries of an existing theory. Let's refresh our memory. What is a theory? Theory explains what, how, and why. Boundary conditions of a theory refers to specifying what, how, and why of a theory. It also refers to one aspect of a theory. The boundary specification process zooms into the context of interest. It sheds light on the limits and constraints of a theory. Scientists have tried to no avail to come up with a theory that explains everything. To the best of my knowledge, there is no theory of everything, at least not yet. This means all theory have limits. They can only be applied to explain some, but not all phenomena. To explore boundaries of a theory is to place limitations on the proposition generated from a theoretical model. These temporal and contextual factors set the boundaries of generalizability and as such constitute the range of the theory. It is a widespread assumption that shared decision-making improves decision quality. This assumption has been emphasized frequently when people discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion. They argue that making decisions as a group, especially in a group with members' diverse backgrounds, can push people toward consensus and the middle ground in decision-making. But after sitting in many meetings, you find that shared decision-making does not necessarily improve decision quality at all times. Specifically, you find that group deliberation sometimes does not balance diverse views, but rather generates a group decision that is even more extreme than any option presented before the group deliberation. This phenomenon is called group polarization. Group decision is more extreme than the group members' mean initial choice. You look into the existing literature on group polarization and find that explanations of a group's choice shift have emphasized group-level conditions, such as group norms, decision rules, a pool of persuasive arguments, and a distribution of initial opinions. Those group-level conditions then become the boundaries of shared decision-making. A theory can fit an empirical reality to different degrees. That degree does not exist in an absolute manner, but depends on an empirical context. For example, organizational citizenship behavior may accurately predict employee job satisfaction when a team leader adheres to fairness. But the relationship between organizational citizenship behavior and employee job satisfaction appears to break down when a team leader fails to enforce fairness. Similarly, although race-based literature on school leadership may explain the collective behavior of schools as organizations in America, it may misrepresent the context of schools in other countries where race is not a dominant marker of social identity. How to explore a theory's boundary conditions? You can refine constructs, amend mediators, and amend moderators to specify boundary conditions and widen the applicability of a theory. Let's start with refining constructs. In leadership literature, many constructs bear a strong resemblance to other constructs. To refine a construct, it is important to start with evaluating the utility of a theory or construct by applying a fundamental principle of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a rule of thumb in science, suggesting that when two explanations of a phenomenon exist, all else being equal, the simpler explanation should be employed. It means we choose a parsimonious explanation. Let's look at charismatic leadership and transformational leadership. In 1947, Max Weber was the first to discuss charismatic leadership in organizations. Weber argued that charisma was a person's perceived capacity to inspire devotion and enthusiasm. It was not something that leaders possess, but rather how much others appreciate a leader's actions. 30 years later, in 1977, Robert House proposed a construct of charismatic leadership. House was probably the first to use the construct of charismatic leadership in contemporary organizational research. Since the 1980s, the construct of charismatic leadership has been on the rise in leadership research. However, it remains a mystery when it comes to what leader behavior is considered charismatic. For example, for some scholars, charismatic leadership was a pattern of leader behavior that included articulating an appealing vision, emphasizing ideological aspects of the work, communicating high-performance expectations, expressing confidence that subordinates can attain them, showing self-confidence, modeling exemplary behavior, and emphasizing collective identity. Other scholars argue that charismatic leaders were those who articulate an innovative strategic vision, showed sensitivity to member needs, displayed unconventional behavior, took personal risk, and showed sensitivity to the environment, such as identifying constraints, threats, and opportunities. Moreover, charisma plays a central role in transformational leadership. It was in 2 of 5 factors of transformational leadership. As a theoretical foundation of multi-factor leadership questionnaire, transformational leadership was defined as idealized influence attributed, which refers to the socialized charisma of the leader, idealized influence behavior, which refers to charismatic actions of the leader that are centered on values, beliefs, and a sense of mission. Third, inspirational motivation. Fourth, intellectual stimulation. And fifth, individualized consideration. You can see there is a great deal of overlap between charismatic leadership and transformational leadership. It was argued that defining leadership through leadership styles may be problematic, as it creates a simplistic stereotype with limited utility. One way to refine construct is to evaluate the utility of a construct. It can be evaluated by content validity, convergent validity, and discriminant validity. Content validity means a construct can be used interchangeably with others, and the construct definition is aligned with its measures. Convergent validity means different measures of the same construct need to have a degree of consistency. For example, 5 dimensions of transformational leadership should be somehow related, but not so highly related as to suggest redundancy. Discriminant validity refers to the distinctiveness of constructs. One approach to evaluate discriminant validity is to compare meta-analytic correlations across the leadership constructs, conduct confirmatory factor analysis, and calculate average variance extracted and composite reliability estimates. If the average variance exceeds the squared factor correlation between any two constructs, then a construct is considered to have discriminant validity. For example, after reviewing 57 meta-analytic leadership studies, George Banks and his team reported that no evidence was found to indicate moral leader behavior was distinct from transformational or charismatic leadership behavior. The second approach to boundary specification is to amend mediators. Adding mediators and moderators is another way to specify the boundary of a theory. Consider that X and Y are two constructs you are interested in. You are interested in figuring out how X and Y work. A mediator is a go-between for X and Y. In this case, X influences a mediator, which influences Y. Suppose that you're interested in a phenomenon that subordinates rarely report their leaders' abusive behavior. You find that conservation of resource theory can explain a subordinate's silence behavior. The conservation of resource theory has 2 principles that explain the protection of resources from being lost. The first principle is the primacy of resource loss. It is more harmful to individuals if they lose resources compared to when there is a gain of resources. Imagine that subordinates who challenge their supervisor are dealt with brutally. Although subordinates are abused by their boss, it is more harmful to subordinates if they report it because they may lose desirable resources, such as continued employment and advancement opportunities. The second principle of the conservation of resource theory is resource investment. People tend to invest resources in order to protect against resource loss, to recover from losses, and to gain resources, to protect against retaliation and losing jobs, and to advance their career. The subordinates are forced to cope with the psychological stress of abusive supervision. The subordinates' coping process could lead to emotional exhaustion, a chronic state of emotional and physical depletion. Being emotionally exhausted, the subordinates may adopt avoidant or passive coping strategies by distancing themselves from the source of stress, which unfortunately is their boss. The coping tactics could include avoid contact, such as climbing stairs if they see the boss walking to an elevator, and intentionally evade feedback from their abusive boss. A vivid recollection I have was that when a school principal finally retired, most teachers in the school were whispering, "Good riddance." The employees' coping tactics then lead to subordinates' silence behavior, which is defined as employees' intentional withholding of critical information, ideas, questions, concerns, or opinions about issues relating to their jobs and their organizations. Inspired by this understanding, you build a theoretical framework to explain the relationship between leaders' abusive supervision and subordinates silence behavior. This is exactly what a group of scholars did in an article titled "The Bad Boss Takes It All: How Abusive Supervision and Leader-Member Exchange Interact to Influence Employee Silence." By specifying boundary conditions of subordinates' silence behavior, the article made a theoretical contribution through explaining how abusive supervision led to subordinates' emotional exhaustion, which then led to subordinates' silence behavior. Another example of a mending mediator is about the mechanisms of narcissism and charismatic leadership. To answer the question of why charismatic leaders are sometimes narcissists, a group of scholars focused on vision. Vision has been considered as Leadership 101. It has been taught in most, if not all, leadership training programs. But most leadership literature only suggests the importance of crafting and articulating a vision, but not the content of a vision, how it is articulated, or to whom the vision is articulated. It is not that any vision inspires people. What's in the vision that truly inspires people? To answer this question, you begin to read literature on vision and come across the idea that a leader's bold vision grabs people's attention, excites people, transcends the existing ways of doing things, and generates admiration for the leader. An example of a bold vision is President John F. Kennedy's speech, "We choose to go to the moon," before a joint session of Congress of the United States in 1962. To rally national support for an exorbitantly expensive program of human exploration to the moon, Kennedy delivered the speech to proclaim his vision of how the United States put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. In that speech, Kennedy famously said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." In the 1960s, that vision was bold. Many people were excited and applied for jobs at NASA. They didn't know how to go to the moon exactly, but they wanted to be part of the group to figure it out. If a bold vision garners people's attention and generates admiration, then narcissistic leaders may be motivated to craft a bold vision. After all, narcissists have a strong innate need for attention and admiration. A bold vision can be used as an instrument to satiate narcissists' strong desire for attention and admiration. With this knowledge, you can develop a theoretical model that specifies boundary conditions of charismatic leaders. This is what scholars did in an article titled "Visionary Communication Qualities as Mediators of the Relationship Between Narcissism and Attributions of Leader Charisma." The third approach to boundary specification is to amend moderators. In addition to mediators, adding moderators can specify boundaries of a theory. A moderator is a variable that influences the strength of a relationship. A moderator has either a buffering effect or a magnifying effect on the relationship. Here I present an example of how a moderator was added to specify boundaries of upper echelons theory. The upper echelons theory postulates that organizational outcomes, such as strategic decisions and organizational performance, can be predicted by upper echelons characteristics. Echelons mean ranks in an organization. Upper echelons, as the name suggests, are those who are at the upper level of an organization. It is important to point out that the upper echelons theory does not focus squarely on a single leader, but the top leadership team. The term excellence is a plural noun. There are two core arguments of the upper excellence theory. First, leaders' knowledge, experience, values, personalities, preferences, and even idiosyncrasies shape how they interpret the situation they face. And second, those personalized interpretations influence their decisions and behaviors. Leaders' characteristics function as a filter and a processor of information. To do so, they go through a three-step process. Leaders' knowledge, experience, values, personalities, and preferences influences, first, field of vision, the direction leaders look and listen. Second, selective perception, what leaders actually see and hear. And the third, interpretation, how leaders attach meanings to what they see and hear. As you can see, the upper excellence theory was developed on the premise of bounded rationality, the idea that complex, uncertain situations are not objectively knowable, but rather are merely interpretation. This is indeed a progress in our understanding of leaders' decision-making. Feeding different leaders with the same information, you get different decisions. This is because leaders process the same information differently with their own knowledge, experience, values, personalities, and preferences. When it comes to what specific psychological and social processes that leaders' characteristics and profiles are converted into strategic decisions, it still remains largely a mystery. This presents an opportunity for you to look into as you develop your research ideas. The upper excellence theory was first published in 1984. It explained how leaders at the top of an organizational hierarchy can influence an organization's outcomes, such as performance, employee job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and organizational citizenship behavior. In the 1970s and 80s, there were two competing views about the relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes. One view came out of the upper excellence theory, which considered that leaders' characteristics greatly influence what happens to their organizations. The competing view came out of institutional theory, which explained why organizations were so similar regardless of who the leaders were. According to the institutional theory, leaders have little impact because organizations were exceedingly resistant to change, cling to well-established practices and procedures, swept along by external forces, and constrained by conventions and norms. To reconcile the two competing views, researchers introduced a construct as a moderator to specify the boundary of a relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes. The new construct is called managerial discretion. They argue that the two competing views are conditionally valid, depending on managerial discretion, which refers to latitude of action. Discretion can come from environmental conditions, such as laws and regulations. Discretion can also come from organizations. For example, whether a weak school board or a demanding, aggressive school board can greatly influence leaders' discretion. The third source of discretion comes from leaders themselves, whether a leader has a high tolerance for ambiguity or not. With an addition of the moderator of managerial discretion, the upper excellence theory has a boundary. If there is a great deal of managerial discretion, then leaders' characteristics will become reflected in their decisions and organizational performance. The relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes would be positive. However, if there is not much managerial discretion because of an aggressive board or chronic low performance as an organization, then leaders' characteristics don't matter much. According to the added boundary specification, a leader without managerial discretion is not expected to have much impact on organizational performance, even when the leader is a strong instructional leader or even when the leader is incompetent. On the one hand, if a leader, Abby, is at an impasse with her supervisor, Abby may have little discretion to use a budget as part of her plan to allocate resources in a way that realizes her vision. On the other hand, Abby could be incompetent, toxic, vengeful, and reckless. In this case, having less managerial discretion may be a blessing for an organization. All theories have a set of assumptions that underlie them and boundary conditions that contain them. It is a theoretical contribution you can make by explicitly considering what those assumptions and boundary conditions might be. You uncover constraints of theories and then find empirical evidence to support or refute existing theories or refine them. To do so, you pay attention to rich context by investigating and explaining cross-context differences. This makes a theory more transferable and applicable for leadership practitioners. In this video and the previous 3 videos, I introduced 4 paths for your research to make a theoretical contribution to your field. You can challenge an existing theory without proposing a new theory. You can challenge a theory by developing a new theory. You can synthesize divergent literature into a fresh theory. You can also specify boundary conditions of a theory. In doing so, you can contribute to ongoing theory conversations or create new theory conversations. There is no singular template for you to make a theoretical contribution. To do it well, it is no trivial undertaking. There is no algorithm for you to write theoretical contributions, but rather to find a way to make your paper's theoretical contribution clear. As you grow as a researcher, you gain more flexibility in writing about theoretical contributions. If you want to know more about how to build a theoretical framework for your research, I have published a book titled Demystify Theories, a workbook for developing theoretical frameworks of educational leadership research. The link of the book is in the description below.